When we think of the Viking Empire, we imagine fearless warriors sailing into battle, raiding kingdoms, and building settlements across Europe. But there's one thing people rarely talk about: how their own personal desires, especially their sexual needs, played a role in their downfall. Yes, you heard that right. Behind the axes, longships, and conquest was a society deeply shaped by passion, power, and control. And over time, those same forces began to pull their empire apart from the inside. Let's start with the basics. The Vikings didn't have a single emperor or king controlling everything. Instead, they were divided into clans and tribes, led by local chieftains. These leaders needed loyalty to survive, and one of the ways they secured that loyalty was through marriage alliances, sexual access, and control over women. In Viking culture, women were often seen as both partners and political tools. Powerful men would take multiple wives or concubines, not just for pleasure, but to show their dominance. These relationships created networks of loyalty, but also jealousy, betrayal, and constant fighting between clans. If one man's wife or daughter was taken or insulted, it could lead to blood feuds that lasted for generations. And it wasn't just about the women. Viking men were expected to prove themselves not only in battle, but in bed. Masculinity, reputation, and honor were deeply connected to sexual strength. If a man was seen as weak or unable to satisfy his partner, it could ruin his social status. Sounds extreme? It was. And it created a society where personal pride and public image often mattered more than unity or peace. As Viking warriors traveled farther into England, France, Russia, and even the Middle East, they brought these beliefs with them. But instead of building lasting empires, many of them settled, married local women, and created mixed families. Over time, this led to a loss of Viking identity, divided loyalties, and internal collapse. In many Viking communities, wives weren't the only women a man could have. Taking mistresses, concubines, or even capturing foreign women during raids was considered a symbol of success. In fact, some warriors returned from battle with gifts in the form of women, treated more like property than people. And this practice didn't just affect the victims, it affected Viking society too. See, when powerful men had multiple partners, it created a shortage of women for other men. Young Viking warriors who didn't yet have status, land, or wealth often found themselves without a chance at marriage. And when large groups of men feel left out of the social system, what do? They fight. Historians believe that this imbalance contributed to internal violence and clan conflicts. Jealousy wasn't just personal, it was political. Clans began attacking one another over women, dowries, and dishonor. These weren't small, private arguments. They were full-scale blood feuds that could last for decades. One insult to a wife or daughter could lead to the burning of farms, murder of entire families, and civil unrest. Even the sagas, the Viking stories passed down through generations, are full of these tragedies. One famous tale tells of Gudrun, a woman whose marriages sparked revenge killings that wiped out entire households. Another saga speaks of a chieftain who started a war simply because someone insulted his lover. And this obsession with sexual pride didn't stop at home. As Vikings expanded their reach into foreign territories, they often failed to keep control of their men. Instead of focusing on empire building, warriors settled in local lands, married into foreign families, and slowly lost touch with their roots. This mix of foreign relationships and divided allegiances made it harder to maintain Viking unity. A warrior who once fought under a Norse king might now fight for his new wife's people. And just like that, the once unstoppable Viking force began to fragment. It wasn't swords or storms that weakened them first. It was the pressure from inside. The hunger for pride, women, and power created cracks that even their strongest ships couldn't hold together. As Viking clans grew in power, their leaders began acting less like warriors and more like kings of personal pleasure. Many chieftains started keeping large households filled not only with wives, but also with concubines, slaves, and entertainers. These homes became centers of luxury and ego, not leadership and discipline. Instead of strengthening their tribes through fair rule, these leaders became distracted. Their focus shifted from diplomacy and defense to maintaining control over personal harems, throwing feasts to impress their rivals, and making bold claims of manhood. And while they were busy chasing women and power, their enemies, both inside and outside, were growing stronger. One major issue was the inheritance problem. In Viking law, children born from different women could all claim a share of the father's wealth, whether they were from the main wife, a concubine, or even a slave. This led to massive disputes after a leader's death. Sons fought sons, brothers betrayed brothers, and clans collapsed under the weight of family civil wars. Take the example of King Harald Fairhair, considered one of the first kings to unite parts of Norway in the 9th century. He had over 20 sons from different women, many of whom claimed land and titles after his death. The result? A brutal power struggle that led to infighting, assassination, and the collapse of many of the alliances he had built during his lifetime. Instead of creating one united Viking nation, leaders like Harald left behind broken kingdoms, each ruled by sons who often hated one another. Their greed for power, and the women who came with it, created a leadership crisis. And a fractured leadership meant a vulnerable empire. Foreign powers noticed this weakness. As Vikings became more divided at home, their enemies in England, France, and Eastern Europe began pushing back. Viking raids that once inspired fear now failed because there was no central command, no unified goal, just scattered bands led by men chasing personal glory. In short, Viking rulers let their private desires shape public policy. And once that happened, their empire didn't need to be destroyed from the outside. It was already collapsing from within. Viking culture was filled with rituals, some bold, some sacred, and some that would shock most modern people. Marriage, fertility, and sexual rights were deeply embedded in their religion and way of life. But over time, these traditions became less about community and more about status and ego. In the early Viking Age, marriages were used to build alliances. A well-placed union could connect two powerful clans and bring years of peace. But as wealth grew, so did pride. Marriages became more about power displays than strategic unity. Chiefs and warriors started marrying for prestige and divorcing just as easily when it suited them. This led to even more fractured alliances and unstable loyalties. Then there were the temple rituals, like those at Uppsala in Sweden, where fertility ceremonies involved sacrifices and symbolic acts tied to sexuality. While these were originally sacred traditions meant to honor gods like Frey and Freya, deities of love, fertility, and abundance, they eventually became opportunities for elite men to show off their control over religion and women. And while all of this was happening, wars, betrayals, shifting values, one thing kept spreading silently: change. By the way, if you're enjoying this journey through Viking history, go ahead and tap that subscribe button. It helps us bring more of these forgotten stories to life. Now back to the fall. Viking funeral practices also showed how much sexuality and honor were linked. In some parts of the Viking world, it was believed that a man's greatness in life, including his sexual prowess, determined his journey to Valhalla. Some funeral rites, as recorded by Ibn Fadlan in 921 AD, even included sexual acts performed during the cremation rituals. These weren't just traditions, they were performances designed to elevate the dead man's status in front of the living. But these beliefs came at a cost. Over generations, the Vikings became obsessed with sexual strength, pride, and legacy. The community spirit that once held their tribes together began to fade. Warriors started serving their own interests. Leaders began ignoring their people, and religion became a tool for justifying personal pleasure rather than guiding social order. As other European societies slowly moved towards structured kingdoms and organized rule, the Vikings remained stuck in a cycle of desire, ego, and division. Their refusal to adapt, to let go of pride and focus on unity, kept dragging them down. By the time their enemies returned stronger, the Vikings weren't ready. Their rituals were still loud, their feasts still grand, but their strength, their unity, and their empire were fading fast. As Viking society continued to splinter from the inside, their enemies on the outside grew more unified, more organized, and more powerful. While Vikings were still arguing over inheritance, women, and honor, the kings of England and France were building armies, fortresses, and centralized governments. By the mid-11th century, the once feared Viking raids were no longer unpredictable attacks. They had become routine and easier to defend against. Villages that used to panic at the sound of longships now had coastal guards, fortified churches, and alliances ready to push back. Inside the Viking world, things were even worse. Because of years of sexual rivalries, broken alliances, and leadership struggles, the trust between clans had all but disappeared. Some Vikings had even turned against their own kind, offering information or military support to rival kingdoms in exchange for land, titles, or marriages. In some cases, Vikings fully abandoned their roots, especially those who had settled in foreign lands. In Normandy, northern France, the descendants of Viking raiders became French-speaking nobles. In England, some Viking rulers intermarried with Anglo-Saxon royalty and dropped Norse traditions. These mixed identities slowly erased what it meant to be a Viking. What began as strength, freedom, independence, and passion had turned into weakness. Without unity, the Vikings couldn't defend their homelands. Without discipline, they couldn't lead. And without control over their personal desires, they couldn't grow. In 1066 AD, the Viking Age officially ended when Harald Hardrada, one of the last great Viking kings, was killed at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in England. Ironically, he died not fighting for Viking land, but trying to claim a foreign throne. And while the final blow came from outside forces, the slow death of the Viking Empire had started long before that. It started in bedrooms and feasting halls, in whispered betrayals and public rivalries. It started when desire overtook discipline and passion overpowered purpose. The Vikings didn't fall because they were weak. They fell because they were human. And like all empires, when desire replaces order, collapse isn't a question of if, it's a question of when. One of the clearest examples of how sexual jealousy and personal desire shattered Viking power comes from the Icelandic sagas, especially the famous Laxdæla saga. This story follows a tragic love triangle between Gudrun, Kjartan, and Bolli, two close cousins and one woman caught between them. Kjartan and Bolli grew up like brothers, trained together, fought together, and were as close as family could be. But when both fell in love with the same woman, Gudrun, their bond was torn apart. Gudrun married Bolli, but it didn't end there. Kjartan returned years later, and the jealousy boiled over. Words turned into wounds, and soon Bolli killed Kjartan in cold blood. But Viking society didn't forget betrayal. In return, Bolli was later hunted down and killed by Kjartan's brothers. What started as a love story ended in multiple murders, broken families, and lifelong blood feuds, all over one woman. And this wasn't fiction. These sagas were often based on real events, recorded and retold because they reflected the reality of Viking life. That sexual betrayal could destroy even the strongest alliances. It wasn't just in sagas. Real Viking rulers also fell to their own desires. For example, Eric Bloodaxe, one of the sons of Harold Fairhair, ruled briefly in Norway and Northumbria. He was known not just for his violence, but for his explosive marriage to Gunhild, a queen often blamed in Norse sources for manipulating Eric into destroying his own rivals, including his brothers. The power struggles within Viking royal families were rarely just about politics. They were personal, emotional, and filled with romantic ambition. One chieftain's wife could spark a war. One accusation of unfaithfulness could tear down an entire clan. These internal conflicts left the Viking world vulnerable. While kings like Ethelstan of England were centralizing power, Viking leaders were still settling personal grudges with axes and revenge killings. And all of it, jealousy, betrayal, desire, kept the Viking world from ever truly becoming an empire. It remained a network of unstable clans ruled by ego and honor rather than law and unity. As Viking warriors expanded westward into England, Ireland, and Frankish territory, they encountered more than just soldiers. They encountered a new religion. Christianity was spreading fast across Europe. And unlike the Norse gods who celebrated strength, passion, and fertility, The Christian God valued discipline, marriage, and sexual restraint. At first, the Vikings mocked it. A single god, no more sacred feasts, no sexual freedom. It seemed weak to men raised on stories of Thor and Freya. But as Viking settlements turned into permanent colonies and warriors began marrying local Christian women, something unexpected started happening. They began to change. By the late 10th century, many Viking leaders had converted to Christianity, not always out of faith, but out of political strategy. It helped them form alliances with Christian kings, gain land, and be accepted into European nobility. But conversion came with conditions. Polygamy was forbidden. Concubinage was condemned. Temples to old gods were destroyed. And so, the very foundation of Viking sexual culture, freedom, fertility, and physical dominance was now considered sinful. This created deep confusion within Viking communities. The younger generation, born into hybrid households of Norse and Christian values, didn't know what to believe. Were they warriors of Odin, proud of their passions? Or were they disciplined followers of Christ, ashamed of their ancestors' behavior? This identity crisis weakened the Vikings even further. Honor-based systems fell apart, replaced by foreign laws and religious guilt. A warrior who once gained status through lovers and bravery was now judged by how morally pure he appeared. Even their funerals changed. The grand ship burials, sometimes involving human or sexual sacrifice, were replaced with quiet Christian graves marked by simple crosses. The sagas faded, the rituals ended, and the loud, passionate culture of the Vikings began to go silent. It wasn't just that Christianity opposed Viking behavior, it slowly replaced it from within, erasing the very code that once made Vikings who they were. And for a people already divided by personal desire, this spiritual shift didn't unite them, it dissolved what little remained of their common identity. Today, when we think of Vikings, we imagine unstoppable warriors, epic longships, and fearless raids. TV shows and video games have turned them into symbols of brute strength and freedom. But the truth is far more complicated, because the Viking Empire didn't collapse from some grand outside invasion. It crumbled from the inside, piece by piece, as personal desire slowly replaced collective duty. Sexual rivalries, jealousy, and lust for personal power pulled apart the very social threads that once made them unbeatable. Their greatest weakness wasn't steel, it was seduction. Not because desire is wrong, but because when it's unchecked and used to manipulate, betray, or conquer your own people, it turns a strong culture into a divided one. And while Christianity and external politics certainly played a part, it was the emotional chaos from within that truly doomed the Viking Age. Lovers turned into enemies, passion turned into war, and leaders became too focused on bedrooms instead of battlefields. Yet, despite their fall, the Viking story isn't one of shame. It's a reminder, a lesson. Even the most fearless warriors can be destroyed by the very things they refuse to control. Not every empire falls to armies. Some fall to emotions. But their spirit didn't fully disappear. The Viking legacy lives on in stories, in names, in the DNA of millions across Europe. And perhaps most powerfully, in the lesson they leave behind. That strength without control is dangerous. And passion without purpose is a slow-burning fire that can consume even the mightiest of empires. So the next time you see a Viking helmet or hear the echo of a war drum, remember the story isn't just about power. It's about what happens when that power becomes personal. And when passion, unchecked, leads even gods of war to their knees. If this story gave you a new perspective on Vikings, let us know in the comments. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and click the bell icon so you never miss these hidden stories from history. And if you want a more brutal truth about ancient empires, click the next video right here. We'll see you there.